In the description box of this video, you will find a link to my new interactive adventure, which was released yesterday. Have fun.
And it was obsessive and oppressive. It determined what you did.
Oh.
Yes.
I don't think it was, particularly wasn't felt as oppressive in period. Even if you think, once again, a little modernism there, Professor, it's oppressive to you. I think that's a completely wrong way to look at it. Like, I completely disagree with the Professor here. If that were the case, Professor, and this is my counter-argument since you did provide an example. Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to listen and react to a very famous podcast which is hosted by a, once again, very popular creator that I think most of you know, Lex Fridman. Now, love him or hate him, I know that some people can't stand him, some people like him a lot. I personally like him and I like his show. One of the things that I like from Lex is, in fact, those scientific podcast interviews that he has, mostly focused on like physics, but also the future, AI, all of that stuff. I usually put it as a background while I play my Backrooms games because I'm addicted to those. So I'm playing Backroom, and in the meantime I will listen to the podcast, and he has some excellent speakers. Now, he also has oftentimes political speakers. I usually skip those because I find them boring, but the parts that I'm interested, as I say, is of course the science part and history whenever he does have a historian. Now, he has recently had a very important podcast that has to do with ancient Rome, which is this one here, where he invited Gregory Aldrete, if I'm pronouncing it correct, and the title is The Roman Empire, Rise and Fall of Ancient Rome. Of course, an enormous topic, and indeed, this is a pretty long, I believe, podcast episode, but I would like to listen to it and react.
So Rome always wins because even if they lose battles, they go to the Italian allies and half-citizens and raise new armies. So how do you beat them? He can never raise that many troops himself. And Hannibal, I think, correctly figures out.
I see, this is a little bit of a cut-off from, I think, what they believe is the most interesting part. I mean, I've got a few things to say about Hannibal and Carthage myself, so let's see. Punic Wars.
The one way to maybe defeat Rome is to cut them away from their allies. Well, how do you do this? Hannibal's plan is, I'm not going to wait and fight the Romans in Spain or North Africa. I'm going to invade Italy. So I'm going to strike at the heart of this growing Roman Empire.
If we're talking about Hannibal, it's republic, though. It's not an empire. I imagine it's, of course, he knows that he's the historian. Maybe a little bit of a slip of the tongue, I suppose.
And my hope is that if I can win a couple big battles against Rome in Italy, the Italians will want their freedom back, and they'll rebel from Rome and maybe even join me. Because most people who have been conquered want their freedom back. So this is a reasonable plan.
I think this is interesting. I'd like to add something. The idea of the conquered and the conquerors when it comes to ancient Rome is the fact that one of the strategies that the Romans had to ensure that the conquered would not want to rebel in the future was the idea of breathing them out. What I mean by that is not that the Romans were indeed doing some sort of ethnic cleansing or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that they would give citizenship. And now, of course, how much citizenship and how freely it was given changes depending on who's the emperor, the senate, and lots of political intrigue that I don't want to go into it, otherwise it's going to be a 10 hours episode. But definitely giving citizenship and making sure that people felt that they were part of a whole was a great way to plant a seed. And then as those children that are born and now are Roman because they're inside a Roman province and the parents have been given citizenship and the children are Roman, would essentially ensure that after a few generations, these kids, these people in this new colony or what have you, territory that Rome has subdued, don't even feel like the Romans are the oppressors or the Romans are the conquerors, because they are Roman themselves. And therefore, as I was saying initially, they breed them out because they are all Roman now from a cultural perspective, and therefore they're all citizen, they speak Latin, and they may have completely forgotten that they were once the enemies. That is something that Rome did.
So Hannibal famously crosses the Alps with elephants, dramatic stuff. Nobody expects him to do this. Nobody thinks you can do this. Shows up in northern Italy. Romans send an army. Hannibal massacres them. He is a military genius. Rome takes a year, raises a second army. We know this story. Sends it against Hannibal. Hannibal wipes him out. Rome gets clever this time. They say, okay, Hannibal's different. we're going to take 2 years, raise 2 armies, and send them both out at the same time against Hannibal. So they do this, and this is the Battle of Cannae, which is one of the most famous battles in history.
I'm actually very interested to see what he's going to say about the Battle of Cannae, because there are discordant interpretations, and I want to see which one he chooses.
Hannibal is facing this army of 80,000 Romans about, and he comes up with a strategy called double envelopment. I mean, we can go into it later if you want, but it's this famous strategy where he basically kind of sucks the Romans in, surrounds them on all sides.
And then the cavalry, yeah.
And in one afternoon, at the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal kills about 60,000 Romans. Now, just to put that in perspective, that's more Romans hacked to death in one afternoon with swords than Americans died in 20 years in Vietnam.
Okay, so that's the path he chose. Interesting, very interesting. I've got something to say, and this is just the beginning. This is going to be a long one. How long is this? Definitely have to go episodes. Okay, one thing that I wish he had pointed out in this case is that actually this is the fulcrum of a very long debate between historians. And I'm talking about the actual numbers of Roman death during this battle. So he mentioned 60,000. Actually, the number that I thought was reported was 50,000. I might need to double check because, once again, he is the professional historian here. And indeed, that is reported in the sources. But there is contention among historians, and some think that this is an exaggerated number, whereas others believe that their report is in fact correct. Now, notice that I said the sources, and indeed it's more than one, but it's two, generally speaking. We're talking about Polybius on one hand and Quintus Fabius Pictor on the other. And of these two, I would give even more credibility and salience to Pictor's account because, I mean, he's from that period specifically. Now, I personally tend to agree with those historians that do believe that these numbers are approximately correct, which I think is also his path. But I think, so we agree, it's not that I'm disagreeing with him, but simply I think it would have been important for context to provide this piece of information that not historians agree on this. Now, the reason why some people disagree is because they say maybe these numbers were exaggerated. And indeed, it is in Roman fashion to exaggerate the numbers that have to do specifically with the casualties of battles. But generally speaking, this happens in favor of the Romans in the sense that they will increase the number of dead on the opposite side to make themselves look better and decrease the number of casualties on their own side, once again for the same reported reason. So in this case, it is kind of difficult to utilize this piece of information to say, oh yeah, the Romans just manufactured the numbers, and in reality, the number of deaths would have been, 10,000 and not 50,000, because, I mean, at the end of the day, they are talking about their own deaths. So the only way I could see this even make sense to just give a little point and credibility to the people that are contrasting the idea of these numbers being real is maybe at the end of the war they changed this just to say, look, we were defeated so badly, but then Rome still won, and so we are so cool, just to put it out there. But then again, I'm not really convinced with this. And that is because there are some practical caveats that need to be added to this discussion. One of these is the fact that after the Battle of Cannae and this terrible disaster, Rome has to recruit a new legion, right? Because, yeah, they lost so many soldiers, they still have to prevent, if not kick Hannibal out, whom, by the way, will stay there for years, but if not kicking him out, at least they need to be able to defend their territories as much as possible. But in the next legion, possibly legions, I'll have to double check the sources again, but in the next legions that they raise them using Wallones, who are a specific type of slaves to whom is promised freedom if they help winning the war. And when it comes to the armament of these slaves that now are utilized as sort of improvised soldiers, when it comes to their equipment, weapons and armor, they use loot from previous wars that they had won, and this loot was specifically taken from the temples of Jupiter Feretrius. This in itself is such an extreme practice that it really does speak to the possibility that yes, the Romans would have only done it if they had had tremendous casualties during the Battle of Cannae. Now, did they really lose 50,000 people, or maybe more, 60,000 like it's saying? It's difficult to say, but I do tend to believe and agree with those historians that think that even if this wasn't exactly to the last number an accurate integer, an accurate accurate amount, still it must have been a disproportionate, an incredible amount of losses that would have been pretty much around those numbers. All right, let's go.
The following is a conversation with Gregory Aldrete, a historian specializing in ancient Rome and military history. This is the Lex Fridman podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Gregory Aldrete.
I think he has a really cool voice. I'll give him that.
What do you think is the big difference between the ancient world and the modern world?
Well, that's a massive question right there. Let's see what he's going to say. What would I say? What is the biggest difference between the modern world and the ancient world? Quality of life, culture, technology, civilization, military warfare. I mean, I don't know. Which one is he going to choose?
Well, the easy answer, the one you often get, is technology.
Tech.
And obviously there's huge differences in technology between the ancient world and today.
Environment, the landscape, the architecture.
But I think some of the more interesting stuff is a little bit more amorphous things, more structural things. So I would say, first of all, childhood mortality. In the ancient world, and this is true of Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, really anybody up until about the Industrial Revolution, about 30 to 40% of kids died before they hit puberty. So, I mean, put yourself in the place of an average inhabitant of the ancient world. If you were an ancient person, 3 or 4 of your kids probably would have died. You would have buried your children. And nowadays we think of that as an unusual thing. And just psychologically, that's a huge thing. You would have seen multiple of your siblings die. If you're a woman, for example, if you were lucky enough to make it to, let's say, age 13.
Yes, I agree with him on this one in the sense that indeed the osteological data, upon any examination, if you put some time into it, does show a very high infant mortality rate. Although, generally speaking, the way I read it, I remember that it had to do within the first year of life. That's when you had the highest level of infant mortality, the first year of life. And a lot of this has to do, for example, with the fact that with modern medicine, we are now able to prevent a lot of diseases that at the time they couldn't, particularly those that have to do with, for example, vitamin deficiencies. But another important thing to underline when we look at this statistic, which if you just look at it in a vacuum, it will actually give you an inconsistent data in the sense that it very much has to do also with social class. And clearly, as you can imagine, logically, the lower the status, the higher the mortality rate would be. Upper echelon of society also had access to better nutrition and a better balanced diet that would influence, and of course many other things, like even access to the sort of medicine that they did have at the time. But in general, the nutrition is an important aspect when it comes to this because it does affect the health of newborn babies, which is why I was saying, even though he mentioned 13 years of age and all of that, it's actually the very early year of the life of a newborn baby that would have been the most dangerous at this time.
If you're a woman, for example, if you were lucky enough to make it to, let's say, age 13, you probably would have to give birth 4 or 5 times in order just to keep the population from dying out.
I really don't think that classical people, I mean, you said all the way up to the Industrial Revolution, but even in classical antiquity, I don't think that women thought that way. I don't remember any indication in the sources whereby we can imagine, well, yeah, a woman thought, oh yeah, by age 13, if I survive, I need to start thinking about having all the kids that I will have when I'm a grown-up, because if I don't have at least 5 kids, how can I help increase the population? That doesn't sound like something that a person in period would think, honestly.
So those kind of grim mortality statistics, I think, are a huge difference psychologically between the ancient world and the modern.
But fundamentally, do you think
Although then again, they don't know anything else. So to them, that's life. They don't have, for us, because we know our current mortality rates and the, medicine and advancement in all sorts of fields that have to do with the longevity of our lives, but also the quality of our lives and nutrition. Now that we know all of this, and when we look back, then we have 2 things to compare, but they don't. If anything, they compare their world to what happened before them. So like the freaking Bronze Age or maybe even the Stone Age. And then, I don't know, I don't think that this is a very fair way to look at it. In fact, it looks to me quite modernist.
human nature changed much? Do you think this is the same elements of what we see today? Fear, greed?
Yes, absolutely. They would be the same.
Love, hope, optimism, and the cynicism, the underlying forces that result in war, all of that permeates human history?
Crude
Yep.
answer, yes. I
Yes.
think human nature is roughly constant. And for me, as an
100% agree.
ancient historian, the kind of documents that I really like dealing with are not the traditional literary sources, but they're the things that give us those little glimpses into everyday life. So stuff like tombstones or graffiti
Stele.
or just something that survives on a scrap of parchment that records a financial transaction. And whenever I
Oh, goodness gracious. Yeah, I can sympathize now. Yeah, I've spent an ungodly amount of time reading stuff like that, particularly also not just in the classical period, but also having to do with like the medieval period when I was trying to understand the prices of items, like how many chickens can you buy with the equivalent of this kind of helmet, that kind of stuff, and then compare it from country by country. There was this very interesting letter written by I think it was like 13th or 14th century Florence, and a certain number of barbutes helmets that they had to buy for the local guard. It was fascinating stuff. So I agree with him 100%.
read some of those, I'll have this moment of, feeling, oh, I know exactly how that person felt. Here across 2,000 years of time,
Beautifully put. Yeah, the connection.
completely different cultures, I have this spark of sympathy with someone from antiquity. And I think as a historian, the way you begin to understand an alien, a foreign culture, which is what these cultures are, is to look for those little moments of sympathy. But on the other hand,
I really like, before he moves on to this other hand, I'd want to say I like the way he's exploring the idea. I kind of want to expand on that. The idea of if you want to really fully understand and comprehend in a culture or a civilization from the past, you kind of have to approach it like you would for an alien, or in this case, like a foreign culture or foreign civilization. And this is true also for civilizations and cultures that occurred in the same lands and territories that we inhabit as modern people. But when you go back 2,000 years and you go back 5,000 years, of course, the language will be different, similarly to how different it would be for you to travel to a distant land and trying to communicate with people and not understanding the local language, not being able to read and write, oftentimes, depending on what civilization specifically we decide to discuss. But in general, even the cultural ideas, the political organization, the economics, the money, the religions would have been so different in the span of time that it really is a good way to approach it when you think of it as when you go to a foreign land and a different culture.
there's ways in which ancient cultures are wildly different from us. So you also look for those moments where you just think, how the hell could these people have done that? I just don't understand how they could have thought or acted in this way. And
that's, again, a little red flag for me, because, I mean, we can't judge I'm not saying that that's what he's saying. I don't want to build a straw man, so feel free to correct me. It's important to underline that we shouldn't judge the past with the metrics of the future, in the sense that, yes, of course, there will be some things that as a modern man I will find abhorrent that have to do with the past. One of which, slavery, for example. Another one, the idea of, selling or owning another human being. Of course, I'm very much pro freedom, so the idea that that was a thing clearly makes me cringe. Even the ability to buy a wife, which is mentioned sometimes on some of the letters that, for example, we get from Roman soldiers as they write home. And of course, in general, gratuitous violence always makes us cringe, even though then again, we do it too. So that's another thing that I think it's important to say. For instance, oftentimes movies depict or represent this idea of gladiatorial games, and then they say, oh, look at all these horrible Romans. They are so bloodthirsty and they love violence. They are so crude. How could they do that? And then we like or enjoy watching MMA. I mean, how different is it really? Also taking into consideration that in general, this idea that movies depict that gladiators would die all the time is incorrect, because gladiators were expensive and they needed to make money to the trainers, the lanista. So the idea of a gladiator dying was in fact quite of a rare occurrence. It did happen. But then again, for the civilization from the future that, for example, doesn't understand the concept of martial arts, could think that our MMA or Kyokushin karate or Seido Kaikan karate, so the full contact styles of boxing, are barbaric, and they could cringe. But within our contextual situation, for us, it's fine. So, of course, yes, there are some aspects of history that as a modern man I find disgusting. But then again, it's also important to be able to, in order to understand them, to put them into their context of the harsh realities in which they were living. Not as a way to justify these, but just to understand them, since understanding appeared to be the problem in this case.
And it's lining up those moments of sympathy and kind of disconnection that I think is when you begin to start to understand a foreign culture or an ancient culture.
I love the idea of assembling the big picture from the details, from the little pieces, because that is
Yeah, I agree. I like his commentary so far, and his line of questioning is pretty good.
the thing that makes up life. The big picture is nothing without the details.
Yep, yep. And those details would bring it to life.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's not the grand sweep of things. It's seeing those little hopes and fears. Another thing that I think is a huge difference between the modern world and the ancient is just basically everybody's a farmer. Everybody's a small family farmer, and we forget this.
Yeah.
I was just writing a lecture.
Would it be nice in this case, I think, to contextualize exactly what you mean by ancient time? But of course, then again, anytime he speaks about the past, unless he specifies otherwise, like he did beforehand when he talked about, and he did it right, I'm not attacking the professor, obviously. He did specify at one point that he was talking about it all the way up to the industrial age. In this case, I imagine he's talking about ancient Rome, of course, so we're not talking about, for example, the feudal system, I don't think.
For my next Great Courses course, and I was writing about farming in the ancient world. And I was really thinking, if we were to write a realistic textbook of, let's say, the Roman Empire, 9 out of 10 chapters
Then they're like the common people.
should be details of what it was like to be a small-time family farmer, because that's what 90% of the people in the ancient world did.
Oh, I would read it. I mean, I would absolutely read it. I would find it fascinating. In fact, I love focusing not only on the famous people like the generals and the condottieri, for example, the medieval period, the kings and all the important people and the bishops, but I'm also interested in the common man and the life of the common people. And sometimes that I find that even to be more interesting. So I agree with the professor on this one. Although then again, I mean, generals are cool.
They weren't soldiers, they weren't priests, they weren't kings, they weren't authors, they weren't artists. They were small town family farmers. And they lived in a little village. They never traveled 20 miles from that village. They were born there. They married somebody from there. They raised kids. They mucked around in the dirt for a couple decades, and they died. They never saw a battle. They never saw a work of art. They never saw a philosopher. They never took part in any of the things we define as being history.
Well, of course, now he's talking about the majority of the population. In the Greek world and in the Roman world, the amphitheater, however, at least for citizens, so maybe not for people who were in a very distant rural area, then I would 100% agree with him. But like for the citizen, that was a form of entertainment. And in a way, even the idea of they have never seen a form of art. Well, if you live in Rome, you are surrounded by art. So I don't exactly understand what he means. I mean, I imagine he's just talking about small rural realities. Although then again, even to sell, oftentimes if you lived in a rural area, you would travel to sell some of the produce that you would create to a city. And at the end of the day, when you are in ancient Rome or in ancient Greece, art is all over the place. Temples are all over the place. Religion is very much part, and religion is connected to art. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would have said it exactly like he did, but then again, once again, pinch of salt with me, he's the pro.
So that's what life should be, and that's representative.
Nevertheless, it is the emperors and the philosophers and the artists and the warriors who carve history.
And it is the important stuff. So, I mean, you know, that's true. There's a reason we focus on that.
That's a good reminder, though, if we want to truly empathize and
Both very cool. I like the historian, by the way.
understand what life was like, we have to represent it fully.
And I would say let's not forget them. So let's not forget what life was like for 80-90% of the people in the ancient world, the ones
Absolutely.
we don't talk about, because that's important too.
So the Roman Empire is widely considered to be the most powerful, influential, and impactful empire in human history. What are some reasons for that?
Now watch all of the comments talking about the British Empire in comparison or the Mongol Empire in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, Rome has been hugely influential, I think, just because of the image. I mean,
Yeah, it's together with Greece, the base of Western civilization. Even our law today is based on Roman law.
there's all these practical ways. I mean, the words I'm using to speak with you today, 30% are direct from Latin, another 30% are from Latin-descended languages. Our law...
Yeah, I always say, actually, on my second channel, Metatron's Academy, where I focus mostly on language, I always say that English is a Romance language that pretends to be Germanic. Well, that's just me.
law codes, I mean, our habits, our holidays, everything comes fairly directly from the ancient world. But the image of Rome, at least again in Western civilization, has really been the dominant image of a successful empire. And I think that's what gives it a lot of its fascination. This idea that, oh, it was this great, powerful, culturally influential empire. And there
You know what I find interesting about this? Of course, I agree with the professor. But one thing that I find interesting is how, yes, we look back at Rome and we think, wow, the Roman Empire was very, very successful. And, in a certain degree, that is absolutely true. Because, for example, if you look at how professional the Roman army was, you won't be able to achieve the same level of professionalism all the way to the early modern period. In the sense that even in the medieval period, where technologically medieval armies were more advanced than Roman armies, still they weren't as professional as the Roman legions. So that is absolutely an aspect that is interesting. But then again, instead, if we read some of the authors during the imperial time in Rome, then oftentimes they look back at the republican time as the pinnacle of sophistication. Isn't that interesting? Kind of sort of marks the idea of your neighbor's grass is always greener, but on a time scale. Fascinating stuff.
there's a lot of other empires. I mean, we could talk about ancient China, which arguably was just as big as Rome, just as culturally sophisticated, lasted about the same amount of time. But at least in Western civilization, Rome is the paradigm. But Rome is a little schizophrenic in that it's both the empire, when it was ruled by emperors, which is one kind of model, and it's the Roman Republic, when it was
Fantastic. Yeah, we are on the same line of thought.
a pseudo-democracy, which is a different model. And it's interesting how some later civilizations tend to either focus on one or the other of those. So, the United States, revolutionary France, they were very obsessed with the Roman Republic as a model. But other people, Mussolini, Hitler, Napoleon, they were very obsessed with the empire, Victorian Britain, as a model. So,
Oh yeah, Mussolini really tried hard to find connections with the Roman Empire, failing to do so. Even the extended arm was not a thing.
Rome itself has different aspects. Well, what I think is actually another big difference between the modern world and the ancient is our relationship with the past. So one of the keys to understanding all of Roman history is to understand that this was a people who were obsessed with the past and for whom the past had power, not just as something inspirational, but it
Hey, I'm obsessed with the past. What you what you want from me?
actually dictated what you would do in your daily life. And today, especially in the United States, we don't have much of a relationship with the past. We see ourselves as free agents, just floating.
Yeah, I just think that's a problem of educational system, to be honest. Because if you put passionate historians in classrooms with children and with young adults, I think they will appreciate the past very much so. But if you put teachers that don't care and curricula that are badly put together just to call in a quota, then that's why you create that situation. I think it's an educational system failure, probably in connection to political policies perhaps, but I don't particularly like to talk about politics, so I'll leave it at that.
Floating along, not tethered to what came before. And the classical story that I sometimes tell in my classes to illustrate this is Rome started out as a monarchy. They had kings. They were kind of unhappy with their kings. Around 500 BC, they held a revolution and they kicked out the
Some of those kings were Etruscan, by the way.
kings. And one of the guys who played a key role in this was a man named Lucius Junius Brutus. Okay? 500 years later, 500 years down the road, a guy comes along, Julius Caesar, who starts to act like a king. So if you have trouble with kings in Roman society, who are you going to call?
Ghostbusters. I had to do it, sir.
Somebody named Brutus. Now, as it happens, there is a guy named Brutus in Roman society at this time who is one of Julius Caesar's best friends, Marcus Junius Brutus. Now, before I go further with the story, and I think you probably know where it ends, I just have to talk about how important your ancestors are in Roman culture. I mean, if you went to an aristocratic Roman
In fact, ancestors have a religious connotation in ancient Rome. It's very, very religious.
house and opened the front door and walked in, the first thing you would see would be a big wooden cabinet. And if you open that up, what you would see would be row after row of wax death masks. So when a Roman aristocrat died, they literally put hot wax on his face and made an impression of his face at that moment. And they hung these in a big cabinet right inside the front door. So every time you entered your house, you were literally staring at the faces of your ancestors. And every child in that family would have obsessively memorized every accomplishment of every one of those ancestors. He would have known their career, what offices they
Yeah, proud of their heritage, I suppose.
held, what battles they fought in, what they did. When somebody new in the family died, there would be a big funeral, and they would talk about all the things their ancestors had did. The kids in the family would literally take out those masks, tie them onto their own faces, and wear them in the funeral procession. So you were like wearing the face of your ancestors. So you as an individual weren't important. You were just the latest iteration of that family. And there was enormous weight, huge weight, to
Particularly with the patrician families, the gentes.
live up to the deeds of your ancestors. So the Romans were absolutely obsessed with the past, especially with your own family. Every Roman kid who is, let's say, an aristocratic family could tell you every one of his ancestors back centuries. I can't go beyond my grandparents. I don't even know. But
That is such a good point that he's bringing up when it comes to the pedagogical aspects of how children were raised to be Roman. Fascinating stuff. I mean, we do memorize a lot of stuff today that probably, once again, in a few hundred years or maybe in a 1,000 years, people will be like, why the heck did they even bother memorizing all of that? Like, for example, poetry. I mean, I love good poetry, but it's possible that in 1,000 years, if they're a lot more practical, maybe they will be like, well, why did they memorize all of the words written by these people from thousands, from the Middle Ages, It's all really a matter of perspective, I suppose, but it's a very interesting point that he's raising.
that's, maybe 100 years. So it's a completely different attitude towards the past.
And the level of celebration that we have now of the ancestors, even the ones we can name, is not as intense as it was in Roman times.
No, I mean, it was obsessive and oppressive. It determined what you did.
Oh.
Yes, because there's that
I don't know if I would say it was oppressive.
weight for you to act like your ancestors did.
Do you think
I disagree with the term oppressive. I don't think it was, particularly wasn't felt as oppressive in period. Even if you think, once again, a little modernism there, Professor, it's oppressive to you. I don't think it was oppressive to a Roman at all. I think it was just normal. Once again, if we go in the future and someone sees you memorizing something, or maybe memorizing, say, the national anthem, they could think that's oppressive if that's not something that they do. But were you oppressed when you were asked or tasked at school to memorize certain notions? I wouldn't think so. It's just that this happened more at a family level.
not to speak sort of philosophically, but do you think it was limiting to the way the society develops to be
Yes,
deeply constrained by the
I don't. I really don't.
or a bad way, you think?
Well, like everything, it's a little of both. But the bad, so on the one hand, it gives them enormous strength, and it gives them this enormous connection, it gives them guidance. But the negatives, what's interesting, is it makes the Romans extremely traditional-minded and extremely conservative. And I mean conservative in the sense of resistant to change. So in the late Republic, which
Well, no, I understand, but how is that bad? I mean, what I'm trying to understand from this statement is the following. All progress is change, but not all change is progress. If something works, it's not bad to maintain it as is. Whereas if something is broken and you insist to not change it, then yes, of course, that would be limiting at a societal level. But the idea that they were very, I want to say, traditional, well, it worked. For a very long time, they were the masters of the world. So I don't think that, once again, if something works and you maintain it and you stick to tradition in a way that it's beneficial to your society, I don't think it's bad. And it's kind of a strange mentality to think so. In my opinion, sharing an opinion freely here, as I stated before, progress is change, but not all change is progress.
probably talk about later, Rome desperately needed to change certain things, but it was a society that did things the way the ancestors did it, and they didn't make some obvious changes which might have saved their republic.
I wish he gave me some examples here, because he says these are obvious. Like what? Of course, I have a few examples in mind of things that the Romans might have done better, with the understanding of, the future, because we see how things have panned out. Might be obvious to you because of that. But then again, I mean, I don't know, if he doesn't provide any example, I can't really use a counter argument or build anything towards it.
So that's the downside, is that it locks you into something and you can't change. But to get us back to the Brutuses, so 500 years after that first Brutus got rid of kings, Julius Caesar starts to act like a king. One of his best friends is Marcus Junius Brutus. And literally, in the middle of the night, people go to Brutus's house and write graffiti on it that says, "Remember your ancestor." And another one is, I think, "You're no real Brutus." And at that point, he really has no choice. He forms a conspiracy, and on the Ides of March 44 BC, he and 23 other senators take...
Yes, but that's not because our tradition, so it couldn't change. It's because of a threat. There was a political mechanic at play. Not tradition in that case, it was a threat.
Daggers, stick them in Julius Caesar, and kill him for acting like a king. So the way I always pose it...
Which still didn't work, because then we have Octavianus Augustus.
...to my students is, how many of you would stick a knife in your best friend because of what your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather did?
I think that's a completely wrong way to look at it. Like, I completely disagree with the professor here. Once again, he is the important historian in this situation, so I'm just sharing a free opinion on my platform. But I think he's looking at it the wrong way. He's looking at it with the idea of, okay, tradition bad. If you don't change, that's bad. And then he's interpreting this concept of, oh, this man was locked in because of the tradition. If that were the case, Professor, and this is my counter argument since you did provide an example, if that were the case, and Brutus did, in fact, betray his best friend due to his ancestors, then he wouldn't have needed to be reminded. As you very correctly and very strongly pointed out, this is the way any Roman would have been brought up, and therefore it's not something you need to have reminded. Oh yeah, gosh, I've got my ancestors. You know that. You're a Roman. You've been brought up that way. So if this was such a constricting way, or should we say upbringing in this mentality of Romans, then you didn't need to be threatened to do it. No, he did it because it was a threat. There were Julius Caesar had some very powerful enemies. He did a lot of propaganda. His De Bello Gallico is mostly propaganda, and he was hated by specific senatorial classes and patricians because he was accumulating power. And therefore, it is a matter of power. It would have happened whether or not there was a connection with the ancestors, because there were forces that were manipulating Brutus in this case to execute him and to have this whole situation, which, by the way, still failed because, as I say, Octavianus Augustus. I think it's a completely wrong way. So I disagree with this calculation completely.
That's commitment.
That's the power of the past.
Yeah.
That's a society where the past isn't just
That's the power of the graffiti threatening your life.
influential, but it dictates what you do. And that concept, I think, is very alien to us today. We can't imagine murdering our best friend because of what some incredibly distant ancestor did 500 years ago. But to Brutus, there is no choice. You have to do that. And a lot of societies have this power of the past. Today, not so much, but some still do. About a decade ago, I was in Serbia, and I was talking to some of the people there about the breakup of Yugoslavia and some of the wars that had taken place where people turned against their neighbors, basically murdered people they had lived next to for decades. And when I was talking to them...
I hope he's going to mention the economic situation behind that and the political infrastructure underneath it.
Some of them actually brought up things like, oh, well, it was justified because in this battle in 12 whatever, they did this.
That's political propaganda.
And I was thinking, wow, you're citing something from 800 years ago to justify your action.
Don't they do the same in the whole Russian conflict situation, justifying because of this and that happened? People do it all the time. So no, it's not something so weird that only in Serbia and in ancient Rome it happened. I know that that's what we said. He didn't say it only happened in those two, not trying to build a straw man once again. I'm just saying this whole... I hope he doesn't continue on this lane, because I will continue to disagree.
Today, that's a modern person who still understands the power of the past, or maybe is, crippled.
I'll refer you to my dedicated video propaganda lies versus historical truth. It is a deep dive into how propaganda works and how propaganda has worked and still works today, particularly when it comes to, actually including also justification of, for example, wars and the manipulation of the masses.
By it is another way to view it.
So this is an interesting point and an interesting perspective to remember about the way the Romans thought, especially in the context of how power is transferred, whether it's hereditary or not, which changes throughout Roman history.
Precisely. So if they were so monolithic when it comes to traditions, then we wouldn't have kingdom, so regnum, to res publica, republic, then to the empire, the principate, the dominate, the religious changes, the conversion to Christianity. No, the Romans do change. It's just that they try to not change for those things that worked, which is why they were so successful, at least in my opinion.
So it's interesting. It's interesting to remember that, the value of the ancestors.
Yep. And just the weight of tradition.
Weight of
for
tradition.
the Romans, the mos maiorum is this Latin term which means the way the ancestors did it. And it's kind of their word for tradition. So for them, tradition is what your forefathers and mothers did. And you have to follow
Not just for them.
that example, and you have to live up to that.
Does that mean that class mobility was difficult? So if your ancestors were farmers, there was a major constraint on remaining a farmer, essentially?
I mean, the Romans all like to think of themselves as farmers, even filthy rich Romans. It was just their national identity is this citizen, soldier, farmer thing.
Right.
But it did, among the aristocrats, the people who kind of ran things, it was hard to break into that if you didn't have famous ancestors. And it was such a big deal that there was a specific term called a novus homo, a new man, for someone who was the first person in their family to get elected to a major office in the Roman government, because that was a weird and different and new thing. So you actually designated them by this special term. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
So
Interesting. Okay, so I think we are 16 minutes in, and we completed the first section, which was the ancient world, and then Rome expansion, conquering, Punic War, Scipio Africanus, Hannibal. There is a lot to do here, so I'm going to have to divide it into episodes. But I also want to see if you, noble ones, enjoy this, because it's kind of a little bit of a new format for me to react to a full-on podcast. So I'm just going to call it a day for the first episode of this massive, monstrous podcast, which I do very much appreciate. Regardless of, first of all, of course, I appreciate the host, Lex, for providing excellent content, and also I appreciate the guest, the professor, that even though I may disagree on some of the points, of course anything that I do are attacked to the argument, never to the person, no ad hominem whatsoever. And I think it's really cool that he went there and spent almost 4 hours, 3 hours and 42 minutes discussing for something that he's clearly passionate about. All right, number ones, but let me know what you think. If you like this, share it, leave a comment, algorithm nonsense, and let's get the views up, and let's do this. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.